and welcome to the Fulfilling Career Happy Life podcast. This season, we're talking about how different topics impact our career, and they're topics that sometimes we don't stop and think a whole lot about. And so I'm really happy to welcome my guest today, Jon Rennie. Jon has an interesting background. He's gone through three phases of his leadership journey. The first was as a military officer. The second, he has a significant corporate background, and similar to me, went from a corporate background into running his own business. He's currently president and CEO at Peak Demand Inc. He's a best-selling author, and he's host of his own podcast, the Deep Leadership Podcast, which is how Jon and I met when I was on his show. And I was really inspired by him to talk about the topic of risk and security. And in fact, these were two topics that I had as separate things that I wanted to talk about this season. And in the course of Jon and my conversation on his show, I was really inspired that they're sort of two sides of the same coin, risk and security. And I knew Jon would be the right person with whom to speak about that. So Jon, welcome. So happy to have you here.
Randi, it's great to see you again. And now I get to be the guest. So this is the easy part.
That's right. That's right. We're on flip sides of the desk today. So let me start with a really broad question, which is, how do you see, based on your own experience, based on what you've worked with clients on, how do you see risk impacting someone's career? And that question's intentionally broad.
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, if I look at my career and I look at careers of a lot of my friends that, have been able to do some amazing things in their career, is that the risk is a big part of how you take those next steps and how you get to the experiences, you get those opportunities. And it's the willingness to say yes to something that may be difficult. So, for example, I always said yes to taking on the roles where there was a business turnaround situation that I had to lead. And those are risky because usually they're high visibility, usually the stakes are high. But I always looked at it as an opportunity to, showcase my skills as well. So I was willing to take those difficult assignments because I knew A, it would be challenging and rewarding. But B, it would also be a chance to showcase my skill sets to show that I could do difficult things. The flip side of that is that, you could risk failing at that kind of particular opportunity and highly visibly fail and highly visibly let go after not performing. So I think you have to have a bit of self-confidence to take those risks, and you have to have confidence in your own abilities. But I think you only get those you get seen, you get opportunities when you are willing to take the risk and take on a difficult challenge.
I really like the definition that you used, Jon, the willingness to say yes to something that may be difficult.
Mm.
And, we have to get uncomfortable and we have to sort of take that leap. But what occurs to me is we have to know what we can risk. Like, there are times in our lives where we're more risk averse. Like if we've got, a family we need to support, or, the need for that security is different, but you have to know what you can risk in order to take that leap. How do you see like an inability or an unwillingness to take that risk holding people back? Can you think of any examples of that?
Oh, I see it all the time. I mean, I think it's the reason why many people don't leave the corporate environment and do things on their own, because there is a high level of, well, I would say this, there is a level of security. There is a false sense of security, I guess the best way to describe it, when you're in a corporate environment. So you
Yeah,
think,
I
well,
agree with
nothing,
that.
yeah, nothing will ever happen to me. I get a nice paycheck. I get good benefits. In my case, being a senior manager, I was paid really well. So anything beyond that, anything trying to do something different meant that I was putting up all that security, that pay, those benefits at risk for doing something different, like starting my own company or what have you. So I think that we a lot of times feel, I think, many of us who are in senior management felt trapped. Like you really can't, because what are the odds I'm going to find something this lucrative doing it either on my own or with another company. So you sort of like, even though it's not truly golden handcuffs, you really do feel like I'm not going to go anywhere because I don't know that I can get this somewhere else. So you're it's the cost benefit analysis, right? You're looking at this. It could be a major cost to you to lose that comfort that you have, and risking it on something that may fail. So you end up finding yourself locked into these roles. And I have good friends that are in corporate still that won't go. I have a good friend was with this weekend, and he said, I'm never leaving. I have 3 years, I'm going to retire. I'm not going to leave. I have what I need, and I think it sort of locks us in place. And so that security, it feels comforting. So we stay there.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think back to my own corporate career and, these golden handcuffs they put into place from a financial perspective are really motivating. That's the intention of it. And so if for whatever reason it becomes time to walk out of corporate, I mean, I was at a VP level, I was leaving a lot of money on the table. So that's definitely something to think about. But I think a lot of times people don't recognize that not doing the thing may be a risk in and of itself.
It is. Yeah, it is. And it's interesting because when I first left the corporate environment, it was almost like I felt like I felt so good. It was like I left a bad relationship, but I didn't realize it like when I was in the relationship. So you stay there because it's comfortable, but then when you get out of it, you're like, oh, that was unhealthy. Like I was in an unhealthy relationship, but I didn't realize it till I was out of that and on my own. So I think that you're right. We get locked in, and then we say, well, it's not so bad. But then when you really get a chance to get out of it and reflect, you're like, that was kind of bad. So it's a bad relationship, and I'm glad I'm out of it. So, but sometimes you don't see that because and I think we talked about it on my show, is that like the company I work for evolved, it changed, it was different from when I started there, and it wasn't, and not for the good, at least for the employees. And so but I wanted to stay because I felt loyal to that company because they give me so many opportunities. But so I stayed with it even though it got worse and worse, and I kept staying with it. But when I got out, I was like, oh, I should have left a long time ago. you
Yeah.
know?
I mean, it's like the analogy of the frog in hot water. It doesn't
Yes.
notice as it gets turned up. So thinking about your own situation, and you may have seen this in clients too, are there signals that maybe you could have picked up on that may have told you it was time to leave sooner?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that come up. When you start losing the fun, you start, your high levels of stress, high levels of anxiety on those Sunday nights before you're going into the office. um uh just the natural things where you're, sleeplessness and anxiety. Some people fall into depression. But even just the little signs like, I hate this. Like my inside voice will say, this sucks. This is terrible. I hate this. And when you find yourself saying those things, then the question is, what are you doing about it? Right? Because I would just say, well, this sucks, but I've just got to grin and bear it and, get through, because that's the kind of personality I have, is like, I'm going to persevere. But why should I? Why I should have been thinking, maybe it's time to do something different.
Yeah.
So I think it's those really weird feelings that you have, like, something's not right here. This is not comfortable anymore. This is not, I don't feel at home anymore. I don't feel joy anymore.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important because, it's that inner voice that we all have, and sometimes we just don't listen to it. But
Mm,
that Sunday night phenomenon that you mentioned is real. And I remember feeling that, for all the years in school and then all the years in corporate, like Sunday night, my husband used to say on Sunday afternoon, I would start winding up. And I didn't sleep well on Sunday nights because you don't know what's waiting for you Monday morning. There's always
right.
something. And it's interesting because now that I run my own business, I don't have clients scheduled on Mondays so that I have a very flexible day for exactly that reason. And the nature of my work is different. I don't think I would feel it anyway, but like now that I can control that, that's how I do.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that if you can do that, if you can find a place or a role where you can sort of, get your week aligned to what works for you, that's the ideal place to be. But a lot of times when you're working for these big companies, you're a lot of times we would travel on Sundays to be at Monday meetings, and so you lose your weekend, you'd work all week, you work, in these long hours, and again, and I don't know if this is generational too. We've talked about it on my show where, Gen Xers who tended to be like, well, just, didn't have a lot of choice. You sort of did what a company asked of you and you sort of didn't think twice about it. And I think one of the beauties of the younger generations is they've been telling us that, hey, you know what, that's not right. You should look out for yourself as well. And so I hand it to the Gen Zs and millennials to say, they've been saying like, hey, I'm gonna take care of myself first. And I'm like, oh, why didn't I think of that? So
Yeah.
I think they've been helpful to the older generation to say that we should be taking care of ourselves.
I agree with you, and I was talking to somebody about that recently. I think they're smarter than we were in that
Yeah.
regard. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, very much so. Okay, so thinking about risk and the impact like on someone's career, do you see risk tolerance changing over a course of a career?
I do. I really do. And I felt that in my life. So in the beginning, I started my corporate career with no children. I was married with no children. And I was just like, give me the toughest, the weirdest, let's go. I was like moving around. I was taking on, business turnarounds. And then my kids were born, and then they were, and I was raising my kids. And so then it was more like, okay, I still want the difficult assignments, but let's stay here for 6 years or 10 years. Like I didn't want to move as quickly anymore. So I was a little more risk averse during those, years raising the children, because I'm thinking schools and I'm thinking, them having a normal life, and then what's interesting is like when my kids were grown and out of the house, that's when I was like, that's actually when I took the entrepreneurial leap. I'm like, I've got no risk, I paid for the kids are through school, right? They're out of the house, and I'm like, all right, let's go, let's do the things, let's get risky again. So I do think there's those periods in your life where you're more risk averse than you are. So I think maybe the tails, of your career, the beginning and the end, you probably are a little more risky than in the middle.
Yeah, I agree with that. I found that for myself, and I've seen that in a lot of others. And it's like when I was earlier in my career, I thought about risk and my own personal level of risk tolerance and whatever. And I think it was fairly low, but I sort of sensed you could take those risks early on when you like didn't have a lot to lose yet.
Yeah.
And then in the middle, it's harder. But then I found like, when I knew it was time for me to leave corporate and started my own business, in a lot of ways, that was the biggest risk I've ever taken.
Mm,
And I had really moderated that risk because, I had planned for it financially
yeah.
and in terms of support and things like that. I almost feel like on the one hand, yeah, it was a big risk. And on the other hand, because I had planned for it, it wasn't that big a risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it's interesting because I think entrepreneurialism at an older age is probably a better way to go. Only because we're experienced at this point, right? We know our stuff, right? Like for me, I started a manufacturing company. Building the manufacturing plant, developing the products, that was the easy part. I mean, because I've done it for so long, right? And the other thing is too, is we have a nest egg. We built up, some savings, and so we can deal with risk. So you're right. It's probably less risky for us, that left corporate and started our own businesses, because we saved up, we planned for it, and
Yeah.
and again, the risk is lower because we're experienced in what we go into. So typically, and I tell young people when they're saying, "Oh, I want to start a company," I'm like, "Great." I said, my best advice is to go work for somebody else and learn all those skills and then start your company. So you can learn those skills for free and get paid to do it, and then go off and start something. Because I think that really is that helps shorten the learning curve if you do that. So, but I
Yeah.
do think that I think if you want to be an entrepreneur, I think it's a good time to do it when you're older, because of those reasons.
Yeah. It's interesting. I agree with so much of what you're saying. And it occurs to me too that if you've planned, like the financial is the first thing we think about in terms of
Mm,
risk, of course. But maybe when you're later in your career and you've planned financially for the risk, some of the other things that are at risk are your self-perception, your
Mm,
you
yeah.
like, as a big corporate executive, I mean, I could easily be convinced of my own importance. And then I go out of my own business, and who am I? And what is the evidence
Mm.
that I'm still putting value out there? And I guess we risk those things too.
Yeah, we do. That's what I felt like when I left the corporate environment. I felt like I was a big fish in a little pond, and then I went out in the world, and I was like this little tiny fish in a real big world. And then how do you make a name for yourself in that kind of scenario? And I was an officer in the military, and there was sort of like there was a path, right? How do you get promoted? How do you move forward? And in corporate, there's sort of a path. I mean, you can sort of make your own path, but there's ways to be successful in corporate. But when you go off on your own, there's no, you throw out all the textbooks. There is no path. You have to do it on your own, and that can be daunting, because and again, your identity is tied up so much with your work with a lot of people, and so no longer am I a vice president at a big company. I'm Jon Rennie, like who's he? I never heard of him. Like I know you never heard of me, but I really have done some cool things in my life. Let me tell you about it. So I think you have to. It's a little scary when you lose that identity.
Yeah. It definitely was for me. And it took me a while to realize that was even going on. I feel like, I don't know. If I had read a book on it, or been prepared in some way, it might have made it a little bit easier. So maybe somebody listening to us today can be a little bit ahead of where we were on that.
Yes.
So John, I think, one of the things about risk tolerance and need for security, um, it's important for us to, like, be aware of what's our own personal need for that, and do some of that soul searching and think about where we are in it. And like, I guess my thoughts are in and around, how can we figure that out for ourselves, and then how can we act on it?
Well, I think just like anything else, you need to spend time and reflect on your career and where you're headed, and what your goals are and your aspirations. But also, like, keep in mind, like, what are the dreams you had as a kid? What are the things you thought that you would do in your life? And if you find yourself like I did, I was deep in a corporate career, and I was like, I didn't necessarily plan on being here. How did I end up here? And I think having those times to reflect on where you're at can help you make some decisions about what you want to do next. And I would say this too is, if you're married, make sure that these are conversations with the spouse as well too, because if you say, I'm going through a midlife crisis, I'm leaving corporate, I'm starting my own company, and your spouse is not on board with that, then you have put yourself up into a lot of risk that you didn't anticipate. So I think making sure that your partner, your family, is also on board with where you're at from a risk standpoint, because again, it's change, right? And change affects people in different ways. So if you set off on a different journey other than what you're in today, it could have adverse effects on your relationships. So I think it's important to involve your family as well.
That's such a great point, because it's just another thing, as you put it, that is at risk. And in for most of us, that's the most precious thing. So we can't ignore it. Those conversations are so important. Another area that I wanted to explore for a moment, we've talked a lot about risk and need for security as individuals, but
Mm.
so many of our listeners are leaders. And it occurs to me that as leaders, we might have an opportunity, maybe even a responsibility, to set the right environment for our teams to take the right risks. And what are your thoughts around that? Do you have any ideas for our listeners?
Yeah, it's a great point. I didn't really think we would go in this direction, but I do think that the leadership does set the tone in terms of risk taking, or risk aversion inside a company. In a lot of cases, it is whether or not the leader has the people's back, right? So when you have a situation where you have a supportive leader that is really encouraging people to think outside the box and try different things, then we have failure. Failure is typically seen as a learning opportunity, right? So if something goes wrong, we all sit around and think, okay, well, that was a really good attempt at that, but it failed. Why did it fail? What can we do different? And so if you're in an environment where that's encouraged, where risk taking is encouraged and failure is sort of celebrated and learned from, then you're going to be doing some really cool things in that company, and you're going to be doing you're going to be stretching yourself and learning and growing. I've worked for companies where there was where if you did something outside of the normal procedures and it failed, you were let go, you were fired, and so everyone was afraid to draw outside the lines. And so what you end up having is a bunch of uh, employees that were afraid to risk anything. So everybody just play by the rules, stay color within the lines, and the company was stagnant, and people were I don't know, just it was a like the one company I worked for, just the environment was just everybody was apathetic towards like growth or performance. They just sort of didn't care because they were afraid of the consequences of making a mistake. So I think the leader sets the tone with respect to risk. And I think if you're in an environment where people are afraid, then you're not going to be moving forward. You're not going to be doing innovative things. You're going to be following the rules.
Yeah. Oh, so true. And I had this conversation just last week. I was working with a corporate leadership team, and we had that discussion about taking chances and risking failure, and the military concept of the after action review and making sure that we're learning from it. And I've experienced companies that sort of pretend it didn't happen and moved on, and you
Yeah.
miss the opportunity to learn. And
Yeah.
something else you said I think is so important, which is companies where there's a fear of taking risk, the people are stagnant and somewhat apathetic. And like I had the visual of people sort of sitting back in their chairs, and I guarantee you the competition isn't doing that. So,
Yeah.
who knows if your company can even survive if nobody ever takes a risk.
Well, that's it. That's it. And so if you're sitting back, if your employees are sitting back and everyone's afraid to take chances, and your competitors are taking those chances and they are a risk and they are learning through failure, they're going to beat you in the marketplace, and you're going to fail. Your company's going to fail eventually. And so I think, yeah, that's not a good environment. I do prefer a environment where we do learn from failure, we do take chances, um, and we have a high level of forgiveness, and we have a high level of learning through failure. That's a big part of what my company is. So, and I make mistakes, and I admittedly, when I make a mistake, I say that was a dumb decision. I shouldn't have done that. But here's what we're going to do differently. I think that's a that the fact that I can admit to failure with my employees says that failing is okay as long as we're doing it in the right way. We're trying to grow, we're trying to get better, we're trying to improve our performance, and sometimes we make a bad call along the way, right? And those are the type of people I want to have working for me, ones that are willing to take chances
Yeah.
in pursuit of better performance.
It's a great point, though, as a leader, if we hold ourselves to be perfect and
Mm,
never admit that something may have gone wrong or we might do something
mm.
differently next time, trust me, the people around us notice. And if we don't acknowledge that and narrate what we're learning from it, we're not setting the environment for them to do it. I think it's a great point. Great. Oh, Jon, our conversation was so thought-provoking for me. I'm so glad that you joined us on the show. Please tell our listeners how they can find you.
Yeah, everything that I have is on my website. It's jonsrennie.com, which is my name. I'm pretty active on social media, more Twitter, I guess X now, than anything else, although I post on LinkedIn and what have you. But the podcast is Deep Leadership Podcast, and it's on all the podcast networks. But yeah, those are the best way to find me. And again, if you reach out to me on X or Twitter, and I usually am talking with people all the time about leadership issues out there. So that's kind of my primary social media channel.
Great. Well, thanks. I'll make sure all that information is in the show notes so people know where to find you. So, Jon, thank you again. I've really, I knew when I was on your show, I'd enjoy our conversation, and you delivered. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Randi. I enjoyed being here.
Thanks so much for listening to Fulfilling Career, Happy Life. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, follow, rate, and review. Do all the things to show your support for this podcast. It helps other professionals who want to feel more energized about their work again find us. And if you want to take this thinking further, please follow me on LinkedIn, where I share content on a regular basis. You can also get on my email list by downloading the Career Satisfaction Assessment or through my website. All these links are in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. I truly appreciate that you make the time for yourself to listen to the show. See you next week.